this has been a strange season to say the least. And that's what I want to talk about some. And what does it look like doing NOBA, doing Baptist associational work from this point forward? For those of you who don't know me, I'm a Southern Baptist. I have graduated from Southern Seminary, Beeson Divinity School at Stanford University, Liberty University, and I attended Southern Baptist Church and been involved in Southern Baptist leadership I was at Southern for a few years, NAM for a few years, and Lifeway for about a decade. I'm constantly in search of a job I can keep, it appears. But I went from Lifeway to lead the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, and more of an interdenominational evangelical ministry focused on evangelism and missions. So good to share with you. And I want to talk some about where we're going, what it means, and look at something of a post-COVID missiology, a post-COVID missiology. And we'll walk through this and kind of one at a time, talk about these things. And I'm going to talk about three big rallies in a minute, but I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is a lot of shaking, and in ways that would have been unprecedented. And I'm not just talking about COVID, though that's certainly part of it. But here we are. We're standing in a time where a lot's been shaken, but we want ultimately us to stand on what cannot be shaken. And so, this is kind of what I talk a little bit about, these pandemics. And I'll walk through, I'll put this back up on the screen in just a minute. I'll walk through this. But one of the things we found is that it wasn't just a pandemic, a virus. It wasn't just a virus. The world seems to have caught on fire in the last 2 years in ways that we didn't expect before. And I want to talk through some of what that looks like. And we've seen that in the SBC. We've seen that in the SBC because what happened is that the pandemics in the culture have seeped into the churches, have seeped into your association, have seeped into the SBC, and it's become very complicated. And so I want to talk about, hopefully serve you in a way. I think I have 30 minutes. Christy, send me a note to just confirm that. I'll go about 30 minutes unless Christy tells me otherwise. And we'll just kind of walk through what those pandemics look like and why ultimately they matter. So let me just share my screen again. So here are the 6 pandemics that I think we should be aware of. And then I'll talk some about specifically 3 ways we kind of walk through it. Okay, she says 45, even better. Probably give us a little time for Q&A. So 6 pandemics. First is a pandemic of disease. That's obvious. We saw that. And of course, even when I start to talk about this, some of you will have an internal reaction to that. Well, Ed, I don't think we should have taken it as seriously, or I think we didn't take it seriously enough, or I think we took it seriously too long. And so what I would say is, if I could just encourage you to listen charitably to my descriptions before I get to some prescriptions, because all of us, we all have opinions on how the pandemic was handled. And I would just say, to quote Taylor Swift, you need to calm down. We all need to calm down just to have this conversation, because we are on the same gospel, the same mission. We're on this journey together. But even talking about the pandemic has become controversial. But here we are, right? So a pandemic of disease, but a pandemic of distrust in culture. It's not just that people disagree with one another; it's that they deeply distrust one another now in ways that are. It's not. You can't say ever. People say the country's the most divided ever, and they clearly don't have a history book because there was a war, and it's called the Civil War. It wasn't very civil, but the country is distrusting each other at higher levels than we've seen in probably any of our lifetimes. Some of you might be old enough to remember the 60s. That's the last time we saw this level of distrust. But for most of us, we're less aware. So there's a sense of distrust in culture. There's a constant defamation from technology. I spoke a couple of days ago to the heads of colleges and universities in Texas. It's actually at Southwestern, at the Riley Center. And David Dockery has this group, the International Association for Christian Education. And I spoke there, and what I said was to these college and university presidents, Houston Baptist was there, and I don't know, Southwest Baptist in Bolivar, whatever, all different folks, Biola University. I said to them, you're going to have to get used to people yelling at you online consistently. If you're going to do anything in a public way, and higher education is a public way, this is going to happen. You've experienced that, right? You've had you had people, question things in ways, and not wrong to question things, but you've had people question things in ways that weren't before. So there's a distrust in culture and that has led to a defamation from technology, where everyone's just free to yell and to blurt and to and social media has really caused a lot of damage. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute. There's also a disorientation in identity. Now, some of that, when we hear identity today, we think of gender identity. We think of somebody who was born biologically male and wants to identify as female, as a woman. And that's part of it. But all our identities are up for grabs right now. It's, what is a woman, right? So there's an identity question. But it's more than that. What is an evangelical Christian is an identity question today. What is a Southern Baptist is an identity question today. And in ways that we haven't seen before, identity has become a pretty huge issue. You'll see this in your association when you have, for example, some of you will have diverse churches. That'd be different places, but those diverse communities have diverse churches. And in those diverse churches, what you'll find is that there's going to be a sense that that in the last couple of years, in some places, African-American leaders are asserting more of an African-American identity, less of a desire to assimilate. The New York Times wrote an article called the Black Exodus from white evangelical churches. Now, again, Exodus is a big word and doesn't mean that everyone's left. But these identity questions have become very, very big. I'm going to pack them more in just a second. Disruption to mental health. I don't even think we know. I think it's going to be a generational impact on mental health with our kids. I recognize, by the way, it's different. And most of you are in the South. I live in Chicagoland. I don't think I mentioned that. I live in Chicagoland. And until just a couple of weeks ago, Chicago schools, first of all, Chicago schools are still in masks. For a year, they didn't meet. When they met in masks. They're still in masks now. And again, I'm not, I recognize, just again, calm down, because I'm not making a statement on whether kids should or shouldn't be masked. I have an opinion on that. And my daughter is not wearing a mask to school, so I have an opinion on that. But what I would say is, and it's just, because the suburbs have changed their rules too, but that's going to have a generational impact. I mean, a generational impact. The disruption to mental health. This is a good time to go into counseling, because people are going to be needing counseling for a very long time. And then the thing that we're challenged to is division in the church. And I'm going to talk some about that in three ways. Going to kind of walk through three ways about how that division in church is really an unparalleled way. Well, I mean, unparalleled since the 60s. Now, again, it might be for you where you are, it might be completely different. You might be in rural Arkansas. You might be in Metro Atlanta. Your experiences may vary, is what I think you sometimes see on an advertisement. Your experiences may vary. So for some of you, I'll describe this. You're like, yeah, this describes our situation. Some of you, it'll be a little more homogenous and maybe less your specific situation. So that being said, let me talk about how we're going to walk through these things. So we look at the 6 pandemics, and now I want to look at 3 post-COVID realities that flow out of, and I'm going to weave through the 6 pandemics, right? So the first is COVID and our cultural convulsion. COVID and our cultural convulsion. So cultural convulsion is a strange phrase. So, and I didn't make up the phrase. Well, I sort of modified the phrase. So if you read Outreach Magazine, I'm the editor-in-chief now of Outreach Magazine. And in the most recent, two episodes ago, I wrote about the cultural convulsion. What I'm talking about today, I wrote about, but I'm going to give more in depth to you. So clearly something's changed. We feel it, we sense it. In some places, just relationships are on fire. People you knew, you don't feel like you know anymore. We're just in a very big season of cultural change. And I'm going to show an article by somebody named David Brooks. So let me just look right in the camera and say, it's not the most recent article that David Brooks wrote about evangelicals, and which I would have some issues with. But this was really helpful. It wasn't about faith or really. David Brooks is a relatively new follower of Jesus, attending an Anglican church in the DC area, if I recall. But this is the article that I'm talking about. He wrote it last year, and it was America is having a moral convulsion. And, the subtitle, I think you'd agree wholeheartedly, but subtitle, levels of trust in this country, in our institutions, in our politics, and in one another are in precipitous decline. And when social trust collapses, nations fail. Can we get back to it before it's too late? Now, what I think is so interesting about the article is he actually cites, I think, two authors that point back to the fact that every 60 years, America seems to go through a cultural convulsion. Every 60 years, America goes through a cultural convulsion. So the last time we saw that was the 60s. And his thesis is that people question everything, and they begin to believe differing versions of reality. So people in the 60s, I mean, again, I don't know, maybe Eddie Miller, he could have been a hippie in the 60s with that beard. But, if you're a hippie in the 60s, you lived in a different reality. You didn't believe the mainstream news. You didn't believe, and, you were charting a path. It was a different reality. And that's what often happens in a cultural convulsion. And people have, all the pandemics I listed. So let's take a moment and let's go through 2020 for just a moment. I need you to just stay with me and listen charitably to my descriptions. 2020 began because right now I'm about to mention Donald Trump, Joe Biden, impeachment, vaccines, masks, George Floyd, summer riots, and stop the steal. So I just need everyone to, because I'm trying to illustrate something. And so what then am I illustrating? Well, let's start. Let's go back to the January. Thanks, Randy dropped that article in the chat. Super, thanks to Randy. Let's go back to January 2020, because you might have forgotten, but January 2020 began with an impeachment. The impeachment, he was impeached but not convicted. And so by then you knew the country was divided. Now, it didn't all start in January 2020. There's a whole lot of division before that. But January 2020, we see an impeachment, and boy, the country's divided, and we feel it, right? And then it's just a few months later when we start to hear about a virus. I think they called it the Wuhan flu at first, or something like that. And we begin to hear about this, and people don't know how to respond, right? So people start responding differently. And so I was actually, some of you use some of our resources that we created at coronavirusandthechurch.com. And the reason we did that was, as a fun fact, I was actually at the White House meeting with the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams. And we were actually doing we were making a plan that I would have reached out to you to help with. The plan was, HIV/AIDS is actually spreading fastest in rural religious communities right now. And so we were meeting with the head of the NAE, the head of the Church of God in Christ, which is a Black Pentecostal denomination, and the Surgeon General. And so he just came back from a meeting, and I'm trying to remember, we had a couple conversations, and the big conversation shifted to the Wuhan flu, or whatever it was called at that time. And he was very much, he said at that point, or maybe a later meeting, I don't remember, he said, you got to warn the churches. This is going to be a very big deal. It's going to be a very big deal. So I did a Facebook Live from my basement that some of you watched. 200,000 people ended up watching, about 200,000, a little less than that, watched the Facebook Live. And in there, I sort of warned about the churches need to be more ready. It's not just about streaming. Because remember, President Trump shut down the country. And for 2 weeks, the first it was 15 days, was 2 weeks to stop the spread. I missed 2 weeks to stop the spread. So, and then he extended it to another month. And I remember I was with Donna, who some of you have met. I was with Donna, and I said to Donna, I was trying to be funny because, it was like, our daughter's high school activities all canceled. Our daughter's college, shut down. Everybody. 96%, I think the Lifeway research study said 96% of churches stopped meeting with the presidential decree. And most that didn't were small rural churches that were, COVID was just a reality far away at that time. So I said to Donna, trying to be clever, trying to be funny, because I'm a charming husband. I said, so I'm an extrovert. Most of you know that. She's an introvert. And I said, hey, so is this like a good thing that we're going to get another month? We can just kind of not see other people and kind of introvert for a month? And she smiled and she said, honey, are you going to be here the whole time? So clearly that was not her idea of a fun, quiet month. But still, the country was pretty united, But it didn't last. So it was united around the vaccine. It was right at first. It was united around the response. Later, at first, somewhat united around the vaccine, but not later. But then we saw George Floyd murdered on television all around the world. I mean, everybody saw this, and at that point, I mean, you could just. I mean, it was interesting because my guess is your association or the churches in your association, depending on where you are, they held conversations about racial reconciliation, maybe racial justice. Maybe churches in your association, African American pastors, met with Anglo pastors, and because people after George Floyd was murdered, that we started the protests. These protests kind of spread around the world, and people, a lot of pastors were like, well, what do we need to know? What do we need to learn more? A lot of white evangelical pastors were like, maybe we need to learn more. And so all the Christian books that I can't say all, maybe that's too strong, but a whole lot of the Christian books that were sort of out there on, like Trillia Newbell, she's Southern Baptist, she had a book. I mean, she just started selling like crazy. Some books had already been out with the New York Times bestseller list, a year after they were out on issues of race. So I actually got a text from James Meeks, who you might not know, but he's the pastor of one of the largest African American churches in Chicago. He's on the board of Moody Bible Institute. He's a student in my grad program actually now. He pastors a church that it's the largest church built as a church in the United States. It's 10,000 seat sanctuary. Loves Jesus, sharp guy. So he says, we're having a faith leaders march because by now it had actually moved into where there were riots. And we're in Chicago. I was the interim pastor at Moody Church at the time. And there's riots. And so James said, we're gonna pray for racial justice. We're going to work towards a better relationship with the police. And we're going to speak against riots that are destroying our community. Because, at Moody Church, we had people lose everything and people burned up businesses. I mean, Chicago was a big deal. So then people began to say, and a lot of the, I don't know how to do a poll on Twitter, but I think it's interesting to see, but just by a show of hands, some of you got your hands up, the way it prioritizes it. If you're live on your video, I can actually see you. So I just want to know how many of you had churches in your association where the pastor mentioned George Floyd by name at some point from the pulpit. Would you raise your hand for just a second, just so I can see how many of you? Okay, lots of you. Okay, because that became an issue later. And I'm gonna talk about that in just a moment, because people were holding signs saying "Say his name," right? So and sometimes, well, I bet you had churches in your association who put out a statement about race and then had to put out another one because it had to be clarified after. So some of you nodding your head. Yeah. Okay. So, because by this point, though, something's going on. I saw that head's nodding, right? Something's going on here. So if a church in your association or in your associational newsletter mentioned George Floyd by name, and then the summer riots came, and you didn't mention the summer riots, people began to notice. This is going to be a key thing for just a minute, right? So pastors began to say, okay, people are watching what I'm saying more closely. If you mention George Floyd by name and then didn't mention summer riots, and again, summer riots are different places. You're in a northern urban area like I am. It was a very, very big deal. They know Chicago, but Chicago has a river and a lot of waterways through it. And they actually raised the bridges. It looked like something out of a medieval castle. They raised the bridges so you see people what it looked like. Okay, Charles Spielman actually says we actually hosted roundtable, several pastors from diverse churches. I bet that a lot of us did that because there was a sense in that summer 2020 we're like, oh, we got to be more aware of some of these issues. And a lot of evangelicals said that. Matter of fact, at the Faith Leaders March I was at, I had like almost all the pastors I know were texting me saying, are you going? You want to go? I mean, it was a whole lot of white, conservative, evangelical, Southern Baptist, and other pastors in praying and more and marching. So, but then the election came, and eventually Fox News declared Joe Biden the winner. Now, I intentionally use Fox News because I guess you can see. So at that point, people had a question. So my phone kind of lights up. People text me, pastors text me and say, well, what am I supposed to say? I say, we always pray for the next president after the election. So, Fox News calls the election for Joe Biden. Do you pray for President-elect Biden? So I call up Rick Warren and I say, Rick, I need you to do a podcast with me now, like right now. I need you to stop what you're doing. I need you to go get a microphone in front of you. And I need you to answer the question, what are you going to do this Sunday about praying for President-elect Biden? And he said, the podcast, I don't remember all the details, but he said it's all online. But he said, I'm going to pray for President-elect Biden. The election's been decided. I'm praying for President-elect Biden. And we would later, I preached it this summer, and we would later talk about this. And I some of those things were challenging for them. Rick and Kay were talking about how them praying for President-elect Biden after the election, while still a percentage of people were saying it was stolen. Okay, so stay with me. Fast forward to January 6th. Just so we can get one more thing. I think we get January 6th. We're near the end. There was impeachment after January 6th, but let's not get to that one. I've probably talked about enough. In fact, poor Willie McLaurin is coming in. He's going to what in the world have I walked into? But stay with me. So then January 6th comes, and the Capitol rioters who broke into, and there's all different kinds of people there. Not everyone was the same thing. Like most things, not everyone's the same thing. So, They get into the floor of the House and the Senate, and they pray in Jesus' name, which is kind of jarring to a lot of us. We saw a lot of Christian signs, right? So what then happens is that some churches respond. They want to put a little distance. They want to say, that's not us. I saw one comedian put in her bio, I'm a Christian, but the love your neighbor kind, not the storm the Capitol kind, right? So there's a sense. Now, again, can I ask you again? Because now I know it wells up in us again. Can we take a deep breath and just calm down for just a second? Because here's my point, right? If your church mentioned George Floyd by name, prayed for President-elect Biden, and then made a statement about the Capitol riot, but didn't mention the summer riots and didn't stand on whatever other issues might be out there, you began to find yourself questioned by people in your congregation. Many of you are nodding your heads. So now almost every church I know, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, has had people leave because the pastor is either too woke, because the pastor mentioned George Floyd and maybe prayed for President-elect Biden, and maybe didn't mention the police, didn't support the police in the summer. Which, by the way, I do think we're seeing. I come from a law enforcement family and a civil service family. We're seeing consequences of the demonization of the police. Let me add, but so depending on what you did. Now, on the other hand, if you didn't mention George Floyd, when people are holding up signs saying "say his name," let's not be in favor of some sort of generic. And this was before he was convicted. So when I said he was, when he was murdered, some of you at the beginning were like, "Oh, we murdered." I get it, but he was convicted of murder. So that's the definition at this point. So but some people were like, "Okay, you didn't mention George Floyd," and so, I just recently had a church in Atlanta where African American and people of color are saying we think our church needs to be involved more on some of these issues, whereas sometimes the Angle members are saying, we think we've already addressed those issues. We've made statements, we did things. So what you're seeing is this cultural convulsion is everyone's like having these strong opinions about important things, but this cultural convulsion is not just in the culture, it's coming into the church. And the examples I gave were to illustrate how, so we actually have, for the first time in probably most of our lifetime, we have people come to church and say, you need to speak up about this issue, which 3 years ago we would have never spoken up on. But now there's like, well, you need to speak up on these issues. And it might be you need to stand with President Trump, against the steal. Or it might be you need to, stand up for racial justice and not just for George Floyd, but Ahmaud Arbery and others. And so this is what a cultural convulsion looks like. Now, here's the thing I want you to hear. If you came into 2019 without a reservoir of resilience, 2020 hit you in the face. And it's the division that's here is actually not going away. I think it's going to accelerate. Let me talk a little more about that. So America's having a moral convulsion, right? Now, by the way, let me say a couple things about this article. So Brooks says America, and he says moral, and I change it to Western. It's a Western cultural convulsion because when I'm in Canada, I have a partnership up at Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. When I'm in Canada, it's on fire. Same thing. I mean, the Canadian trucker stuff this week it's a much bigger story in America, but it's still a story in Canada. My daughter's Canada, by the way, lives in Canada. And so the cultural convulsion there, it's in Australia, it's in England, right? So there's a cultural convulsion. It's different. I'm actually going to be living in the UK next year. Oxford's asked me to teach. So I'm going to go teach at Oxford and live in the UK, and partly to try to observe what's it different in different cultures. Okay. Moral convulsion, but let's not stop there. Here's another article I want you to be aware of. This article is called Waking Up in 2030. And it's by a guy named, the author's not on there, a guy named, his name is Ross Douthat. He's a former evangelical, so formerly one of us, who converted to conservative Roman Catholicism. And he's kind of the conservative columnist at the Times. And he actually, he's like really, because he writes books criticizing the Pope for being too liberal. So he writes this article, and this is in June 2020, and it's super helpful because I want you to see something else that's going on in our cultural convulsion. What he says is, the subtitles gets at it, right? The suspended time of the pandemic has put history on fast forward. Thanks, Randy, for dropping that in there. Okay, so here's what I want you to see from this article. Now, he talks about race. I'm going to talk about more than that. Because remember, in summer 2020, many of you were hosting panels, and we were kind of having more conversations about race. Maybe people were talking about systemic racism and how it impacts educational outcomes, or maybe people were talking about property. What James Meeks, I mentioned earlier, says to me that property in his neighborhood doesn't appreciate, property in my neighborhood appreciates, right? It goes up. So here, what happens, and this is really key because this is going to impact the Southern Baptist Convention, right? So June 2020, a lot of people accelerated their discussion about race 10 years in like a few months. So again, the waking up in 2030. So all of a sudden, ideas that were not so common became more talked about. There was a provost at one of our seminaries said, it was very clear that he wasn't affirming critical race theory. Actually, was written against it. But he said something, I'm paraphrasing, that if you peel back the layer, you peel back and look under the, this is a common way to put it, the substructure, the superstructure of our whole society of evangelicalism is built on racism. So that's a strong statement. It wasn't specifically related to the pandemic, but is a real acceleration of conversation about racism. And so people then begin to say, so let's say someone like me, you don't have to agree with me, remember. So I think Daryl made that very clear. I think systemic racism is real, but I don't think, and somebody disagree with me, but I don't think it's like the foundation upon which our society is built. I don't think that it is projected into every context. I think there are places where past racial structures have projected into the present that impact, property values, education outcomes. I do think that people experience, African Americans experience engaging different institutions different than I do. I think that's real. I also think that that's not everywhere for everything. So for some people, it just accelerated, and Christian people who love Jesus, who think that, racism is the superstructure upon which America is built. And so, okay. So that's a sudden acceleration. And so as for me, like I've been, since I planted a church in Buffalo, New York, 30 years ago, I believed in racism. I believe that systemic racism is real and you can identify it. But it's not everything. It's not everywhere. So I didn't really shift a lot. But all of a sudden what happened was there was a bit of a backlash to this. And so we began to hear letters like critical CRT and critical race theory. Which 5 years ago, I hadn't heard about. I didn't learn about that in seminary. And I began to say, what do I need to know? So I started reading books, trying to understand it. But so what happened was it just everything accelerated. And some of us are like, yeah, no, I believe in systemic racism and I have concerns, but I'm not with those guys who accelerated all there that everything's built on. Right? I'm not, I get what they're saying, but I don't hold that view. And then there's other people who say, well, no, systemic racism is critical race theory, and you've just accelerated. And I'm like, well, that's kind of what I thought, 30 years ago in Buffalo. But because everyone kind of went from the starting line and hit the gas, it's suddenly these views just accelerated for all kinds of people. And so I think the SBC, you have to see part of the SBC election. I wrote an article just before the SBC. I'm sure some of you read it. It wasn't always the warmest SBC for me as I wrote it, but I wrote that a lot of this is about how we deal with issues of race. I mean, all the examples in one group's thing, all the examples were either of people of color who articulated something in a way they didn't want to articulate it, or people who supported the people of color who articulated something in a way they didn't want to articulate it. So it's like, okay, wow. So this becomes a big issue. So critical race theory, there's a group of people who think it has infiltrated the SBC. Probably not a secret. I've been one of those people vocally who says that that's a false report. But I would say that people in the SBC have different ideas how to deal with issues and questions of race. So accelerated. Now, let me take it where he didn't take it, because I think it's also worth seeing. It also comes into issues of sexuality and gender, right? Or gender identity. So I don't know about you, but I mean, same-sex marriage, I'm aware of that, that whole debate that went on 40 years till we get to Obergefell, where same-sex marriage becomes the law of the land. And here we find ourselves as Christians outside of the cultural mainstream on this, right? Where our biblical values are controversial. But gender identity is 5 years ago, I didn't hear a lot of people talking about that. Now, in the last year, I've had 5 or 6 people come up to me after a sermon at the church I serve and ask me, my daughter is transitioning and wants to be a man and wants me to use the male pronouns. What should I do? I mean, I can tell you, I don't remember being asked that question 5 years ago through all my ministry. But now it's super accelerated, right? So waking up at 2030, it's super accelerated. So to the point where I'll give you an example, Chicago, where I live, the police officer's contract, if you misgender somebody, you can be fired. I mean, we've seen school teachers lose their job for actually, speaking to somebody who's biologically male as a biological male. And this is a big issue. And, we can sit around in like Southern Baptist denominational life and we can pass resolutions all day long on the importance of what it means that he made them male and female. But our church members are going to workplaces that are requiring them to affirm things that they don't believe, that are not, that are not based on the Bible, but not just based on science. So this is a very sudden acceleration. So part of what happened is all this sort of stuff, it just explodes in the last 2 years. And so we're at a place where people like identity, I talked about the disordering of identity. People don't know who they are. What is a man? What is a woman? What is a Baptist? What is a person of color? What does it mean to be Latino? Latinx is now a thing that's not big in the Latino community, but some more progressive people are using, because you include sexual, often to include gender identity in that as well. So, so if it feels like the world's on fire, it's because it is. And the thing is cultural convulsions tend to last 4 to 6 years, not 2 years. So as we enter the 3rd year of the pandemic, which looks like people are going to move on, and I think I'm ready to. It appears people in California and Illinois, where I am now and where I live in Illinois, are not ready to. But I'm among those ready to. I had COVID in December. I was in New York City preaching at a church. I was doing the interim at Calvary Baptist Church. Some of you know it. It's across the street from Carnegie Hall, where and Stephen Olford used to be the pastor. And right before Christmas, I got there preaching. If you remember, if you saw the national news, it said the Rockettes closed down, and then all the other shows. I was in the line at the Rockettes to go into the show when they came out and closed it down and gave me COVID. But that's another story for the day. And I got Delta. I'm so out of style. I got last season's COVID, but that's another story for another day. I got to move on. So COVID and our cultural convulsion, but here's where it's going to get to some of the church issues, right? COVID and the great sort. The great sort, again, is a word that I'm using, kind of describing some of what is going on, is that people are sorting themselves in ways that they haven't in the past. And this is impacting the SBC as well. So you'll see that in your association, it kind of used to be maybe in your association, because these associations went around before the convention, they've been around before state conventions, and as a concept, not every association. But one of the things that happened is that there was probably before kind of a moderate SBC church that might still be in your association, but it disassociated itself from the SBC. And, they might be more progressive on, maybe it was, I don't know, whatever it may be that people were. And you probably, some of your associations tried to keep peace. Some of you were like, no, we're moving on. We're more aligned with BFM 2000. But this is something different. It feels different because now in associations, people are sorting themselves inside conservative Southern Baptist churches to other conservative Southern Baptist churches over issues that are not theological, but tend to be more ideological. So I see some of you nodding your head. Let me show you a piece of technology that I think will help us to understand this. This right here is a piece of metal. Clearly, it's a pipe. And it's 2,000 years old. I don't know exactly how old this pipe is, but 2,000 years ago in Rome, the Romans discovered a metal that was particularly malleable, and they could mold the thing, and so because it was that way, they could make pipes out of it. And Rome 2,000 years ago had hot and cold running water. Amazing. 2,000 years ago. Slaves would heat the water. People would go into their gondolas and have hot and cold running water coming through these pipes. And they actually it was so amazing. They made bowls out of it and goblets out of it. So the rich would drink from these goblets that were from this moldable metal. Because you can see it's not welded, it's bent. So this technological marvel changed the world. And Rome was 1 million people, and there wasn't another city in the West that was 1 million people to London in the 1700s. So Rome, the only problem was that metal was lead. And so they were drinking out of lead through pipes of lead into bowls of lead. And one historian said I'm paraphrasing, that the technology was feeding them because they were eating out of it. It was feeding them and killing them at the same time. And I think that's what social media and a lot of electronic media is doing to our culture today. It is feeding us a technological marvel and killing us at the same time. This phone here, where all this information comes out, but people are being sorted. Now, again, remember, that's the term that I used, the great sort. And here's one of the things that we learned in the last few years, right? I'm actually here in part creating a discipleship curriculum called Rooted with Eric Geiger, and I are shooting the curriculum together. Many of you know Eric. I saw you look up Mark Marshall when I mentioned Eric. We're back. The band's back together. Earl's here, actually. Jeremy Maxfield. The band's together. So Mark's former Lifeway guy. He knows those guys. So we're shooting a curriculum discipleship. Here's one thing we learned. One of the things we learned in 2020 and 2021 is that people are far more discipled by their cable news choices and their social media. They're discipled by their cable news, and they're spiritually shaped by their social media in a way that we did not expect. And so what's happening, people are now sorting themselves. So I was talking to Matt Chandler. Matt's a pastor in Dallas, Fort Worth. He's a student in my master's degree program at Wheaton. And I was talking about how cable news is sorting people into churches like a way we haven't before. And he said, I can choke you around Dallas. I can take you to the Fox News church. I can take you to the CNN church. He said, I can literally take you to the Fox News church where they broadcast from there. And maybe, I don't know what his church, maybe his church is the MSNBC church. I don't know. But people are sorting themselves. And this is becoming a challenge in SBC life, and it's becoming a challenge in your association. When I preached at Saddleback in August, because this has been an issue at Saddleback, I brought a chart. And 30% we did a survey of pastors for this COVID church attendance tracking project. 30% of pastors said that 30% of the people who knew people were coming to their church because they disagreed with their last church's stance on COVID. So don't miss that. So people are sorting themselves based on COVID policies. And what happens is if your church wore masks, maybe encourage people to get vaccinated. Some churches held vaccination clinics. As that has become more and more of an issue, man, you've got people like, I'm never going back to church. I had somebody post on my Facebook page that they were leaving my church because their words, I was pro-vaccine, pro-abortion, and pro-gender transitioning. And I'm kind of like, wow, that's a third true, because I think, a lot of people's lives were saved with vaccination. But But the other things, what? So why in her mind there's track? Because people began to correlate these things together. So let's go back. So if you mentioned George Floyd by name, but didn't support the police in summer 2020, if you prayed for President-elect Biden after the election, and if you mentioned January 6th, but you didn't speak up about, stop the steal, or whatever it may be, few things for us to consider. It's going to remain a divided time and probably become a more divided time, which I think really has questions for the future of the SBC, state conventions, and the association. Can we be, and I know all of you haven't adopted the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, so let me just speak in terms of like being a national convention. Can we as the national convention unite around the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 as our doctrinal standard and our standard for cooperation? Or will it be Baptist Faith and Message plus new issues that we want to bring forward that become litmus tests in our churches and our seminaries? I think that's a real question. Second thing is, I think we're going to have to build up reservoirs of resilience to get through what will be a difficult next few years. I think that we're, by the way, if someone could highlight me in speaker view, I think a lot of people are looking at the beautiful logo of the Noonday Association, which I think is great, but I think it just flipped over because I dropped out and had to rejoin. But I'm fine either way. I think we're going to have to be prepared for a different way of leadership. I think in the past, the way we led was we kind of went through the conservative resurgence, right? So that was a tumultuous time in our denomination, but not in our culture. Here, the turbulence in the culture coming into the denomination. And I think ultimately, we're going to have to help people, your association directors of missions, right? We're going to have to help people to continue to learn from one another. Remember that summer 2020, we were having these panels together and learning from people of different views. I know some of you doing that now. You would be nervous that somebody would say that you're affirming critical race theory when you're just talking about the lived experience of African Americans might be different than the lived experience of Anglos. So build a sense of resilience to walk through this. And I would say we're going to have courage. The gospel still needs preaching. Women and men are still lost. We can't get distracted from the mission. The moment we're in does not pause the mission we're on. So I really want us to be sure that we are not losing the focus of the mission. But I would say too, keep in mind in Southern Baptist Life, cooperative program giving is up. Any Armstrong record, IMB, 1,000 people in pipeline, as we heard earlier. The convention is not social media. The convention is churches, and nationally we'll show up at Anaheim, you'll show up at your associational meeting. And I would just acknowledge and recognize that this is going to remain a challenging time, but the convention will get through it if we stay focused on missions. Okay, I'm seeing the questions come in here, so we're dropping them in the chat, which is great. Richard Nations asks, you're a trend watcher. What do you think the next big crisis will be? Keeping in mind that I had no plan. I had no understanding that there was going to be a pandemic. So maybe I remember 22 was going to be a great year. I was going to be awesome. We had a nice trip planned. I think that the division will, if it doesn't stop, will turn into growing pockets of violence, which I know is I don't think there's a civil war on the horizon, but I think people are on extremes, are going to say that they're not being listened to. They're going to get more isolated in social media platforms that, keep in mind, a lot of this took place on Facebook groups. And I think we're going to find that people are going to be concerned for the future of their nation and the future of their state because of some of that. Keep in mind, Don Chancellor sent me a direct message. And Don, I haven't seen you on the screen yet, but I know you're there. I was sitting at Don Chancellor's house. I don't know, your kids were there. I don't know if I was babysitting your kids. That'd be weird. I was speaking at an event. Maybe we're hanging around your living room when Oklahoma City bombing took place. And those kinds of things have moved away. We have less of that now. I think we're going to see a growing sense of frustration that could lead to more violence and things of that sort. And again, I think it's on the far left is very radicalized right now, very radicalized. The far right is very radicalized. And I think that, those are some real challenges. Thomas Wright from the Mobile Association. Thomas Wright, like you're the guy I know, right? I think you're the guy I know. Based on your multi-denominational experience, what are creative solutions that have application to leading our associations? Yeah, great question. one of the things that we've seen, and I've had the privilege of working with about 60 different denominations, evangelical denominations. One of the things we've seen is that the places that have been the healthiest have been the closest to the churches, because you can't really caricature people you know. So there are people who think that Al Mohler is this or that. I know I'm making names. There are people who think Al Mohler is this or that. There are people who think Kevin Ezell is this or that. But where you work, you like know the pastors. I mean, some of you, like Dallas Baptist Association has more churches than a lot of denominations have. But most of you know the churches. You have relationships that are there. What I would say is lead our associations by being an invaluable resource to your churches. When I planted every church I planted, we gave 3% to our association. We give 10% to the co-op program, 3% to our association. And because we saw the value of those local partnerships. Also too, Thomas, help pastors and churches of different backgrounds. You're in Mobile, you have significant Latino and significant African-American population, probably in your association as well. Southern Baptists have become a friendly place for people of different races and ethnicities. I mean, one of the untold stories of the SBC, I was talking to the Associated Press, I think it was the AP, and she was trying to talk, how diverse is the SBC? I said, let me tell you how diverse it is. I said, you know what the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is? She said, yeah, it's 11,000 churches. I think it's 11,000 churches. It's the biggest Lutheran church in the United States. I said, there are more non-Anglo SBC churches than there are all ELCA Lutheran churches in the whole country. So some of those are going to be in the association. So don't let people get caught up into, don't let them be discipled by their cable news to the place where, or their social media, because it can be more radicalized there, where they'll actually not build bridges with churches who have different views, who may even have voted differently than they are. People, racial and ethnic realities here do impact that. Okay, so Caleb Duncan. By the way, Thomas, Mobile Association, I'm available to speak next February because I got to get out of Chicago. And so you just let me know when you have a warm day.
So
Caleb Duncan, some of the pastors in my association are focusing a lot of attention on bringing back their old members who stepped away during COVID. How can I work with them as a young leader to help them see the value of embracing where they are and reaching out to their families? Well, Caleb, that was actually my next point that I decided not to get to because these people only gave me 45 minutes. So I don't know what's wrong with them. But let me show you where kind of we are, and I'll just be real quick about that, and I'll blame your question for taking it. So here's where we are, is that it seems that, and this is not true for everyone, but in general, it seems that a lot of churches have actually had people during COVID get more committed. That's why the finances haven't collapsed in your church and your churches, is that because again, remember maybe April 2020, we all thought you're probably looking for a new job as an association because they're going to cut that. But it seems that a third of the people in the typical church got more engaged, more involved. They gave more, they served more, which is great. They're engaged in mission. The third of the churches seem to have been, a third of the people in churches seem to just be hanging on. They're still engaged and involved, but it's just been difficult. But the back third, which in a church of 100 could be like 150 people, because the back third is people who show up Christmas, Easter, and 3 or 4 times a year. They seem to have mostly, if not completely, disconnected. So I do think that it's not a bad thing, Caleb, to try to engage people. What I would say my strategy would be, what I'm encouraging pastors, is to help the front third of the church to engage the second third, to get them the second third at a higher matched mobilization to the first third. And then this Easter, as COVID, I recognize that if you're in Texas, you didn't participate in COVID, and you've been kissing each other on the mouth for 2 years, and I get that. But in places, when you go north, you go west and east, people are responding differently. But I think Easter, case numbers are down. People are talking about, moving into the endemic phase. I think it's a gospel opportunity, and I would go after those missing people, but I would use the front third, help engage the second third to go reach the third. It looks like we gotta wrap this up. So Larry, I think that's great. Larry, I think that, and I'll end with this. Billy Graham, I served the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. Billy Graham said that the greatest regret of his lifetime was not being involved in the civil rights movement. He decided to just proclaim the gospel and focus on that. He didn't go to Selma. He tried to persuade King again away from the March on Washington. And what I would say is, he said that was a great regret of his. So what I would say is, I wouldn't define your ministry by those things. There are people who should define. I mean, that's their call, right? To think of like John Perkins, whose call has been to help white Christians and black Christians learn and grow together. But for most of you, part of our understanding of the gospel leads to the mission, and part of the mission is to seek to make the world more like Jesus would want it to be. And I think being engaged in conversations about race and racial reconciliation are good things.